On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, exactly 100 years ago today, the guns went silent. The war to end all wars was over. Later be renamed World War I, since it actually turned out to not be the last war. It cost the United States the lives of 116,000 servicemen. It also cost our church the lives of 4 of our members. What can we learn from remembering the sacrifice made by the sons and families of our church 100 years ago? Remembering. World War I was a particular brutal war. It was fought for no real point other than national honor and prestige. The country involved practically rushed into conflict with no idea of the upcoming cost and waste that they would soon inflict upon themselves. After 3 years of exhaustive war and literally millions of casualties and no end in sight, the United States was drawn into the war with the main objective of just ending the bloodshed. The United States was indeed successful in bringing the bloodshed to an end after 18 months of battle, but at a cost. Now, the poppies you received as you entered today were originally given in memory of the poppies that grew wild on the mass graves of the fallen soldiers. Today, Armistice Day, now Veterans Day, we remember the members that were lost in the war. Private Edward Heislip. Edward was born in Westfield, and he lived right on 867 North Avenue. He was raised in our church. He went through Sunday school class. He graduated from Westfield High. He was called to Fort Dix in February of 1918, and he served in the battlefields of France. And there he was killed in action. Now, Hyslop Avenue, it's right off of West Broad. It's named in his honor. Private Nelson S. Archbold, Jr. Now, Nelson was also born in Westfield, also raised in our church. He was a classmate with Edward at the high school. He went through our Sunday school here, and at the age of 19, he volunteered for duty, and he became a member of the famous 1st Division, also known as the Big Red One. His division was the very first to be sea action here in France. Later in the war, he survived being attacked by mustard gas, and he was part of the effort and went right across the Rhine, and that helped convince the Germans to sue for peace. Then, the 1st Division was sent home. The 1st Division got to New York for a ticker tape parade, right side with General Jack Black Pershing, marching. The streamers are coming down. You can see them waving and marching in column there. It's like the best time of his life. He's marching, everybody's patting on the back. It's a great time, the best time. Achoo! It's probably during the close quarters of that parade march is when he caught the influenza, also known as the Spanish flu. Later that day, back at Camp Dix, he became sick, and his condition worsened. And later he died on September 26th, the very day that he was to be mustered out of the service. Now, Archbold Place is right behind the library. Today, that bears his name. Now, the Spanish flu had hit the world hard in 1919, causing more casualties than the actual fighting did. The flu soon waylaid across the world, and other of our members who would not even get a chance to go home caught it. Private Ernest F. Dunham. Ernest was a member of our church, and he joined the medical unit in France. I think there is where he also caught the influenza. And on October 2nd, 1919 in France, he also passed away. He'd been employed in the Westfield Trust Company for several years, but when the call came, he enlisted. Now, Dunham Avenue, right off of Clifton, that bears his name as well. sailor George E. Brown. Now, George was born in Boomtown, but later he moved to Westfield. He joined our church, and he was about 30 years old when he enlisted. He was a machinist mate in the U.S. Navy, and he had been in France for about 1 month. There he was likewise stricken with the influenza. He died in France on October 15, 1990, and he is buried in a French cemetery. Now, Brown Avenue is right off of Brightwood. It bears his name. Now, in addition to having streets named after these supreme honor men, they're memorized right across the street in the pillar in a circle that's right in front of our church. And indeed, if you look at the front of our bulletin, they're memorized right in a plaque that's right on our narthex. So why did our sons go off to war in 1917? Now, originally, the U.S. did not want to have anything to do with the European war. In fact, President Wilson won the 1960 election with the tagline, "He kept us out of war." But the war went on and on. The death and the pain and the suffering seemed only to be increasing and spreading. The United States saw its own ships sunk and citizens being killed in an expanding theater of war. Both sides had fought the war to a standstill, and the only strategy that seemed to be is just to kill enough of each other so there to be no one left to fight. The United States entered the war not for prestige, not for territory gain, not for reward, but just to end the bloodshed. Now, Alvin York, a soldier from Tennessee, he was an amazing backwoods marksman, but he was also an avowed pacifist due to a recent religious conversion. "Forgive those who trespass against us. Thou shalt not kill." They were more than just words to Alvin York. The last thing Alvin wanted to do was to hurt anyone. But when his country called, he answered. During the war, his unit was pinned down and being mauled by German machine gunners. Seeing the situation was dire, he worked his way behind the enemy lines and began to quickly pick off German machine gunners from the rear. Thinking that they'd been surrounded by a superior force, the Germans surrendered to York, and he had captured single-handedly over 100 German soldiers. Now, when asked how his actions reconciled with his deep religious beliefs against killing, Alvin just stated that all the men in his unit were just being murdered by those machine guns, and he had to do something. So York did it just to save the lives. So that is what the member of our church did. They put themselves in harm's way, not seeking trouble, but rather to end it. They went to save lives, to ensure a quick end to the war's bloodshed. Now, did we end the war only to lose the peace? The United States entry to war was decisive in ending the bloodshed. The war was won, but the bitter feelings on the side of the Allies led to a punitive and unforgiving treaty against the Germans. The Treaty of Versailles, forced on Germany at the end of World War I, was meant to crush the German nation economically and militarily. This was to prevent Germany from ever being a threat to the Allies again. Large parts of their industrial lands were taken away, and Germany was forced to pay a huge monetary restitution, and it quickly enveloped the German nation and economy into a terrible depression. This situation led to political turmoil, and in Germany it later allowed Hitler and the Nazis to rise to power, control the government. This directly led to World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust, the unforgiveness. Now, hate and unforgiveness always cause grief. The Tree of Life recent shooting is just the most recent example of this. Now, contrast that harsh Treaty of Versailles to the much more forgiving Marshall Plan after World War II, where the U.S. directly funded the restoration of a bombed-out Germany, helped them get that nation's economy back up on their feet. And since then, Germany has become a world promoter of peace. The Versailles Treaty was intended to punish Germany for fighting the war and make sure they'd not be capable of a new one. But instead, it led directly to the next one. As Mahatma Gandhi said, "An eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind." And the Allies themselves are blinded by the bitter feelings over the war. With the Marshall Plan, the Allies in fact forgave their former enemies help the people get back up on their feet, and create a democratic government. As Jesus tells us, forgiveness, not force, is the only way to lasting peace. Love your enemy is something we should all take to heart, as it not only makes you a better person, but can prevent greater loss and sorrow later. So how did God reach out during this war? The war was proclaimed by the Allied clergy, the Great Crusade against the evils of German militarism. Gott mit uns, God is with us, was stamped on the buckle of every Prussian soldier. Both sides proclaimed that God was on their side during the war. Both were right, but not exactly in the way they've been proclaiming. As you heard in Deuteronomy, God loves the foreigner residing among us, as you yourself are also foreigners. Everyone is a foreigner, that is, until you get to know them as a person. In the first Christmas of the war in 1914, the British and the Germans on one section of the land manned the trenches within hearing distance of each other. As Christmas Day began, the Germans began to sing Stille Nacht. The British sang back the same song, Silent Night. Then a brave German ventured out into no man's land, carrying a gift of a loaf of bread and a bottle of wine. Soon all the soldiers left their trenches and greeted each other and shared what food they had. An impromptu communion celebrating the Lord. They sang more Christmas songs together. They even played a game of football between the wire obstacles. At the end of the day, each side wished each other well and went back to their trenches. For the war was to begin again the next day. God's voice, inspiring peace and forgiveness, had been reaching out to both sides that night through song. Now, when the generals on both sides heard what had happened, they immediately ordered the two units to different parts of the front. The generals feared that their soldiers would no longer consider the men on the other trenches the enemy, but rather fellow human beings. This just would not do. They had already lost so much for the war for it to just end. Peace and forgiveness just were not an option. It's a tragedy that the generals and the politicians did not follow up on the alternate suggestion of peace and forgiveness that God had voiced on that first Christmas Day through song. And God would continue to remain there on the battlefield, speaking to those who would listen and comforting those who reached out. God was there for all. Finally, on the 11th hour, on the 11th day, the 11th month, 100 years ago, the guns went silent. Kurt Vonnegut mentions in his book, Breakfast of Champions, that for many years afterward, the veteran said that the sudden silence was the voice of God. The voice of God, stressing peace and forgiveness, was always there from the beginning of the war, through the song Silent Night, and throughout the war to the last, by the sudden silence of the guns. War is a terrible blight upon humanity, and all effort should go toward preventing or ending them as quickly as possible. That is what the United States and our fellow members did in World War I, helped us end the bloodshed. However, it is not enough to end fighting and still not forgive your enemy, for that only sets up the next conflict. Only through forgiveness and realizing that there are no foreigners in the world, that we are all united together as God's children, is there a true path toward peace and fellowship that God offers us all. We just have to realize it and accept it, just as the troops did on that first Christmas Day in 1914. As you leave the service today, remember to look up at the plaque in the narthex. Give a small prayer of thanks to Edward and Nelson and Ernst and George and all our veterans who made sacrifice and effort to make the world a safer place for everyone. Amen.